would and could tell you where to go get fish, where to go get berries, where to go harvest food, and how to. And those are things that have allowed us to keep our connection with the land and be connected to the land. And so the rural communities, there is this really strong connection that is an unspoken living part of who we are. That value that is distilled within ourselves has allowed us to not only survive, but start to thrive now. Thrive in a way that allows us to celebrate our culture, to share openly who we are, instead of, as I was growing up, be shamed about it, be shamed about my brown skin. That resilience is there. And I see that in all Alaska Native cultures. And I see in more recently the next generation of them embracing their cultures, them embracing their languages, they're embracing who they are openly and with dignity, not just pride, but with dignity. And that makes us an amazing people.
Can
you speak to the scale and the longevity of the enslavement of the Indigenous peoples?
Well, the enslavement started from 1784 when the Russians first came to Kodiak with cannons, with the intent to subjugate the people for the peoples of Russia, for the Tsar of Russia. From 1784 until 1867, and then 1867 on, after Alaska was sold to America, natives had no rights. We lost our rights to our own self-governance. We lost our rights to our own land, to our own resources. We lost any control over any of that. And we're still fighting over it today. We're still fighting for it, not over it, for it, to keep some of that with us. And you have all these other things. People are like, oh, natives, you got the corporations, you guys are rich in that. People that really got rich were the lawyers. And now people have made changes so that our communities are doing better. But if you look at the sale of Alaska, and then you look at the land claims, we were given pennies for our land, pennies for acres of our land. If you go back and look at the history, the last 20,000 years, or if you want based on archaeological, the last 12,000 years based on just carbon dating, but the last 5,000 years, all of Alaska was occupied by Native peoples. Every stream that has fish in it, you'll find a site. So we're fighting not only just to keep what we have, but to raise an awareness of how do we care for what's left. Our lands have been exploited and exploited and exploited. From the Russian period with sea otters to the American period in our region with salmon, moving on to the natural resources from gold to oil, all of these things, we're still fighting to keep preserved. So we are still dealing with a lot of things and having to fight.
I
hope your film will raise an awareness of not only the rich diversity of Indigenous communities and that we're still here, but how important it is to teach true facts, as painful as they are, of what really happened. And not shy away from, hey, yes, we're sorry this happened, but we need to know this so that we can move forward too, both as Indigenous communities, but as a nation. If we don't, we're just going to continue repeating to do the same thing to each other over and over and over out of sheer ignorance. Because if you don't know your history, you're being ignorant, and you should know your history. I think once you are able to get through these really difficult subjects and issues and topics, you'll start to see how amazing the Indigenous communities are in our nation and across the world. Because every community that is from one specific area cares for their environment, cares for where they're from. And then they want to make sure that it is sustainable for generations, not just one generation, generations to come. And getting into that will allow us to learn about what we can learn from natives about how to better treat our regions, our local communities, our lands, and where we're from. We have a lot to learn. What I would classify as enslavement was during both Shelikof and Baranov's period, the men were taken to hunt sea otters. And the women, the children, the elders that were left behind had to go and gather food, but they had to give it to the Russians. And then they had to work to get that food back in order to eat, even in order to live. So that enslavement there, and then the enslavement of the men that were then taken from Kodiak all the way down to Fort Ross and all the way over to the Kuriil Islands because they were so efficient. So they were enslaved in that way. They ended up having to work for the company. And this process, actually I saw this as a kid growing up where you had in the American system, the canneries bought the boats and then allowed the natives to run the boats, but only gave them a portion of the money from what they caught. And then they had to buy the food from the company and then earn over the winter. When they would buy the food, they'd be indebted to the company. And so you had that process of being indebted over and over and over. You would be having this indentured servant during 40s and 50s and 60s when I was growing up. And when I was finally realized this, I was like, oh my God, it's like, wait a minute, this is indentured servants. Because they fished for the canneries in the summertime and made money. But then they had to buy the food from the canneries over the winter. So by the time they came to the summertime, they were in debt. So they had to work their way out of debt. And so you just got this process of them being in debt to the companies until I think the mid-60s and 70s. And that's the same process that happened during the Russian period. People were indebted because they got food, which their families gathered, but they had to pay for the food, and they had to go out and get more sea otters to pay for the food, and et cetera. So it became the indentured servants. But one thing that did happen, and I'm still learning more about this process, in the Russian period, Shelikof and Baranov didn't want the natives to be baptized. Because in the Russian system, if you became baptized into the Russian Orthodox faith, you were treated as a Russian citizen. When the priests came to Kodiak in the 1790s, there was mass conversion so that the people would not be enslaved as they were before during both Shelikov's and then primarily in the early stages of Baranov's reign. Why is it hard to go through and learning about the facts of what happened? It's kind of scary because depending on your community, some of the people are still related to those, the ones that it happened to. It's painful because when I first started learning about and realizing what happened to my ancestors and realizing what happened in my community, it's painful because you realize they had no voice. They had no way to say no. They had no ability to protect themselves. When you really think about that, having no rights, no voice, no ability to say, no, this is wrong, and if you did, you were killed, is, I want to say, daunting, because then you think about what your ancestors, my ancestors had to go through in order to just survive. During the Russian and American period, we've been surviving. And if you read the historical accounts, the natives were surviving and when we came in there and this and that. Prior to contact, natives across all of North and South America were thriving. There were millions of us. We were thriving. We weren't surviving. It was only after contact that people went into survival mode, because in our region, you lose 90% of your people, if not more. What are you going to do? You're not going to fight the system. You're going to do whatever it takes to survive. And realizing that, and realizing the privileges we have now, is, I think, important but also daunting because it's like, how do we change that? How do we learn from that? And for me, how do we move forward so that we don't repeat it? I mean, our current state of affairs is, to me, pretty scary. And it's not just this country, it's other major countries that this is happening in. Things we don't hear about, what's happening in Russia, or other countries for South America, and what's happening to people who don't have a voice.
How or why did you personally choose this field of research?
I chose to go into, originally it was archaeology. My first grade teacher at my wedding gave me a paper I wrote in first grade. And I wrote, what if bones could speak? What would they say? And that was in first grade. And so I had no idea how or why I wrote that. But I ended up going into archaeology because I wanted to learn about the history of my ancestors. Because you'd find archaeological pieces, you find stone tools, but there was nothing written about them. We didn't know who made them. We didn't know how they were made. And so I wanted to go to learn about our history. And the only way I knew about our history was through archaeology. And so I ended up going to see some digs in Three Saints Bay, and then digging at Refuge Rock, and then also going out and doing excavations in the Kurile Islands, where our people were taken as slaves. People who were workforces were made to go and hunt for sea otters in the Kurile Islands. In 1991, when I just lived in Russia for a year. And so I spent 3 months as a translator 2 months as a translator for a crew that came from Kodiak and working with Russians. And we went out to Kuriles to excavate in Aleut Bay, where the Russians had taken the natives from Kodiak and the Aleutians to hunt the sea otters. Those people were then, after 1867, were then moved to the Yellow River or something like that. I think it's the Yellow River up north by Petropavlovsk. Most of them starved, half of them starved to death, and then they were moved out to the Commander Islands where they are today. So it was more about wanting to learn about our history and how do we write about it, but how do we share it? What makes Alaska unique is we still have access to our land, our resources. We are still connected and we haven't been displaced. Yes, the Onongan people were displaced during World War II, but a majority of Alaskan natives, we all have family that still live where our ancestors have been for thousands of years. That makes us unique. The other things that also make us unique is we're able to pass that knowledge on, whether it's in English or in our original language, of how to live with the land where we are at. I think that's one of the things that makes us unique.
So we were wanting to ask you, how were you taught about slavery in school, and how were you taught the story of Thanksgiving?
Well, I was taught slavery was people being taken from Africa to America and being sold like animals and treated like animals to do labor that other people didn't want to do. And they did that work in order for other people to make money off of them. And then we had the Civil War and people were freed. Yeah, that's what we were taught in high school or junior high. The basics of slavery, the subjugation of who they were as people. What's interesting about that is, I saw on TV a person of color, but the first time I ever met a person of color, I was 13 years old. And I was pretty amazed by that because I was like, wow, there's somebody darker than me. And I went and talked to him. He was with the National Guard. He was wonderful. He answered all my dumb questions. And he was very nice about it. And it's just, you could tell that, he probably was asked these questions, but I was asking questions to learn. I learned from him about who he was, where he was from. And I was just curious about who he was as a human being. What we learned about slavery was the horrific things that happened what happened